Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from our episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have Ken Paxton has an AI ad running depicting Tallarico transing children. Yes, partying Daisy. This is the third AI ad on Tallarico that Republicans have launched in Texas, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the YAPM subreddit. And yeah, personally, if people want to justify having AI ads, they should be able to do so. I think libertarian position regarding AI is you should be able to use it for whatever tools you want to. I personally don't really care that if someone uses AI and presents something as legitimate, especially if it looks nearly indistinguishable from really legitimate. But ultimately, people are going to justify if they justify. Ultimately, if people want to justify making ads with AI, I think they should be able to. And if they, I don't care what party they are, they should definitely be able to. They don't justify doing that. They justify whatever you want to justify. And if a station wants to air it, they should be able to. And if they don't want to air it, they should be able to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Bill Maher rips Paul for publishing Fauci Diaries. Your entire brand is standard right to privacy, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the politics subreddit, and that's an article from thehill.com. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position here is, people should have a right to privacy, but people are working on as a member of the government, that right to privacy shouldn't be, you should be held accountable for what you're doing. I think it's interesting. Reddit always says, we gotta hold government members accountable for their corruption, but then suddenly someone who the media says is good and who's more marketed as in-group rather than out-group, like Dr. Fauci, is being held accountable. Reddit says, no, you can't hold him accountable. That's against the rules. And it just goes to show you, a lot of politics people just really just who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. They'll want the out-group held accountable to the fullest extent of the law while constantly making excuses for members of the in-group. And it just goes to show you, people don't really have any consistent values, only teams. Reddit should be happy that they're holding a member of Trump's deep state accountable, but since he's in-group coded rather than out-group coded, they think it's the worst thing ever. Next we have, after 2 decades of raids and prison stints, Liverpool's cannabis martyr is still fighting for freedom, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is cannabis should be legal, and you should be able to do whatever you want with it. Same with any other material. I personally don't think you should be out on the streets tweaking out on drugs all day, but if you want to justify doing that, that's on you. It should be your body, your choice. Next, we have Max Miller still refuses to drop out per spokeswoman source, and then it's a link from Poll Tracker 2024 on X, and then it's a cross post from the YAPM subreddit, and that they have a screenshot of that tweet. Ohio 07, NYT, Max Miller, Republican accused of abuse, won't drop out. Spokeswoman says Mr. Miller, who has faced pressure from fellow Republicans to end his campaign and avoid endangering a solidly red seat in Ohio, will stay in the race, the spokeswoman said. And yeah, ultimately, if he wants to justify doing that, he has every ability just by doing that. I personally don't really care for him or a lot of members of the Uniparty, with some exceptions like maybe Thomas Massey and O'Connor. But ultimately, it's all just political theater, I would say. People should be held to a higher standard, but ultimately they're all members of the deep state. If the media wants to go after him for abuse, they can do that. They went after Democrats for abuse as well, like Eric Swalwell and Graham Plattner, and they dropped out. If he doesn't want to drop out, though, that's on him. I don't think it really matters. He'll just be replaced by another uniparty shill. Only this one, I guess, won't have allegations of abuse from his significant other. Next we have part 2, is it good or bad to have more rich people, posted by OK Information 9286, and that's an article from danielmitchell.wordpress.com. And personally, I think the libertarian position is, ultimately, I think everyone should be rich, but ultimately it comes down to what resources everyone possesses. I would say the libertarian position is it's good to have more rich people. Everyone should be rich to some extent. But ultimately, it does come down to sometimes of a hierarchy will develop just like everything else. But I think as long as that hierarchy is voluntary, that's okay. What I don't care about the government is that it's a forced hierarchy that people are forced to participate in. You have to obey the laws of the state. What capitalism, although it isn't a perfect system, and the ideal form of it will be a voluntary hierarchy. If people want to participate in the capitalist system, they should be able to. But if they want to participate, we're living on their own in the communist system, and not force down others without their consent, they should be able to as well. Ultimately, it should come down to what each individual wants to justify. If they want to participate in this capitalist hierarchy, they should be able to. If they want to participate in a communist hierarchy, they should be able to. If they want to participate in any system of hierarchy, they should be able to. Ultimately, what it should come down to what everyone wants to justify. Next we have He's Not Wrong, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Thomas Massey subreddit, and that's a tweet from Thomas Massey. Of all the stupid things this administration has done, hiding Epstein files, trying to pass tariffs without Congress, advocating for more spending, ignoring Doge, and indemnifying glyphosate, starting a war in the Middle East will prove to be their biggest and most costly blunder. And I would agree with that. It's like that one quote from the Princess Bride, one of the great blunders is starting a land war in Asia, and the U.S. government just keeps starting land wars in Asia, be it in Iran or Iraq or Vietnam. Well, I guess Vietnam they didn't really start. That was more that they were already fighting, but they came in. But it's same kind of thing of Korea, and you can pretty much name any Asian countries. And U.S. has had involvement there. So I definitely do think that the war in the Middle East isn't good. But that's pretty par for the course at this point. The U.S. is always pretty much bombing brown people in the Middle East, but Reddit just doesn't care for it because the out group's in power currently rather than the in group. Next, we have Elon Musk's efforts to cut spending in the government were so incompetent that shocking internal analysis finds, posted by Donald Key, and that's a crosspost from the No Shit Sherlock subreddit, and that's an article from uk.news.yahoo.com. And yeah, personally, I'm glad that they tried to cut spending, but it doesn't mean it was going to be effective. Of course, Reddit, if Elon was still in-group coded rather than out-group coded, they would commend his efforts to cut government waste. But now that he's out-group coded, suddenly it's the worst thing ever to try and do that. And I personally think we should be cutting government waste. But of course, Reddit, that they hate that. They'll say, oh, since they defunded USA, it's killed millions of people. Well, in reality, the U.S. shouldn't be providing foreign aid for other countries. If people want to spend their taxpayer dollars on foreign aid, and when they want to earmark their taxpayer dollars for that, I think they should be able to do so. But right now, people are forced to do whatever the government says, and I think cutting foreign aid, I definitely do think there are better things they could have cut, like most of the military budget. But I definitely do think any government cuts are justified, since the government's just going to spend money like there's no tomorrow, and at the very least it should be spending it on its own citizen rather than foreigners. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, can these two work together on a common goal, posted by LP of PC, and that's a cross post from the Granby CO subreddit, and it looks like a Reddit post from /JustJimmy5, and they said Granby Liberty on the rocks, Granby's back, and they're protesting flock cameras. And then there's a screenshot of a Facebook post from Grand County Democrat Socialist, and they say those who would give essential liberty to purchase low temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety, Benjamin Franklin. And they have a bean that says get the flock out, flock camera pictured. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is you gotta stand. You should work for people who might disagree with you on other issues. Just because you disagree on one issue doesn't mean you have to agree on all of them. And I personally don't really care for the Democrat Socialists, but I think if they want to work with libertarians on getting rid of the flock cameras, I think they should have every right to do so. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, in post-Soviet Georgia, a fledgling libertarian movement faces an increasingly authoritarian state, posted from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, I'm glad that Georgia has a libertarian movement, but ultimately, all libertarian movements have to do with an authoritarian state, and sometimes, that's just how it is. The authoritarian state is always going to be there, even if the libertarian takes over, like Javier Milei in Argentina. The authoritarian state's going to be there. Just because the libertarian controls the state doesn't mean it's not still innately authoritarian. I think that's a very important distinction to remember as well. Next, we have the core of the quote-unquote libertarian worldview: private property, skepticism of authority, free market, spontaneous order, individualism, and negative liberty, posted by Lemon Limelight, and that's from press.princeton.edu. And they added, in their book, the individualists Matt Walensky and John Tomasi identify 6 markers of membership shared by everyone in the libertarian family: private property, perhaps the central defining feature of libertarianism; skepticism of authority; free market; spontaneous order; individualism; negative liberty. Do you think this is a good set of ideas for defining libertarianism? Would you change anything? And I personally think I would agree if those are all good libertarian ideals. So I definitely personally would agree with all that, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have the affordability agenda that taxes your dinner, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's a cross post from that's a article from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if people want to pay taxes on their dinner, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to pay taxes on their dinner if they don't want to, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Fiscal Conservatism in Action, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the bond market subreddit, and that looks like a tweet from Crypto Rover, who tweeted, "This is insane. There is now a 35% chance that U.S. national debt will hit $50 trillion by 2028, before the end of Trump's current term. If that happens, Trump will be solely responsible for adding approximately 43% of the total U.S. debt across his 2 terms." And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but, ultimately, the U.S., I think it's interesting how Trump markets himself as a fiscal conservative, when in reality, he's just to spend like there's no tomorrow Democrat. You can tell he used to be a Democrat because, he spends like there's no tomorrow. But even if among a lot of the Republicans that don't used to be Democrats, they still spend like there's no tomorrow. Fiscal conservatism isn't really something that's really practiced in Washington these days, and hasn't been for, I'd say, decades at this point, at the minimum, I would say. Next, we have Trump's proposed anti-trans gun rule suddenly had thousands of new supporters, most were bots, from Advocate.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And I actually replied to this, I think this article, or at least this had the same subject of the article, on the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, everyone who disagrees with me is a bot, average Redditor. And, personally, I don't think there are bots for pretty much every issue, but of course Reddit's gonna, say this is gonna be these are the worst bots since they go against their agenda. I think it's interesting. Reddit wants to disarm anyone who identifies as MAGA. You talk about disarming trans people, and they think it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, personally, I definitely do think there's probably bots when it comes to this, but ultimately, I definitely do think, that's very much social media for you. There's always going to be bots pushing an agenda, just like there'll be like, Redditors are pretty much in some regards even worse than bots, I would say. I said in response to another comment, I said on my previous one, yeah, Reddit definitely has a massive bot problem. You can tell when you're replying to a bot on this website when that tends to be more coherent and less antagonistic than your average Redditor. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for bots, but ultimately they exist, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about people. If people want to justify having them, justify doing whatever you want to. Same with, it's the same with AI I talked about earlier. If you want to justify putting out bots out there that push agendas, you should be able to. Ultimately, it comes down to what each individual is wanting to justify. I personally care for, dealing with humans online rather than bots, but, if you want to push out bots, you should be able to justify doing whatever you want to. Next, we have lobbying is legalized bribery, posted by Rabat Ascalon. That's cross post from the Defend Aid to Israel subreddit, and that looks like a video of Tucker Carlson talking about how big the Israel lobby in DC is. And yeah, I personally don't care for the Israel lobby in DC, but that's just one of many. I definitely do think if American taxpayers want to give money to Israel, they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to do so if they don't want to. And a lot of times, people are forced to pay taxes. They don't even get to determine where the money goes to. At the very least, I think if they are forced to pay taxes, they should at least very much get to choose earmarks where their taxpayers' dollars go to. If they want to send it to Israel, that's their justification. But right now, I think they should at least be able to choose whether or not to do so. Next, we have a year into Trump's unprecedented deployment, National Guard is entrenched in D.C. on premises both sides, though, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's an article from abcnews.com. And yeah, personally, I don't really care having the National Guard in D.C., but ultimately the U.S. government can deploy the National Guard wherever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And even if, you pass Defend Guard legislation, the state governments will still be able to put the National Guard wherever they feel like, and there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have police department in South Carolina says it has zero tolerance for hate speech, and posted from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine, and I replied to this, are there them posting this on the anarcho-capitalist subreddit, because, I can't post a reply on this subreddit since I'm banned, despite claiming to be libertarian and uncensored. It's very much like the Holy Roman Empire and being nothing it claims to be. And I said, the state can say any speech it doesn't like is hate speech. I know a lot of Reddit progs who were for the state implementing hate speech laws during Biden's tenure, who are now conveniently against it now that the out-group is in power. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And so, and I had some posts I wanted to share from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit as well. I posted a couple days ago. I said, why gatekeeping libertarianism is necessary. I said, gatekeeping as a whole is something that's kind of inherently not libertarian. You shouldn't be telling other people what labels they can and can't use for themselves. With that being said, you do have to hold other people to standard to some extent. Recently, 2 former NBA players, Enes Kanter and Royce White, have declared for the WNBA draft as a means of saying that since anyone can just identify as a woman for any reason according to the progressive worldview, that they should be able to as well. It's the exact same when it comes to libertarianism. Anything else for that matter. Just because someone should be free to label themselves as libertarians doesn't actually make them so. Thoughts. And yeah, if you want to identify as libertarian, you should be able to. If you want to identify as a Pikachu, you should be able to. But ultimately, just because you identify something doesn't mean other people should be forced to comply. It's the same when it comes to pretty much anything. Libertarian, woman, Pikachu, autistic, etc., etc. Identify as whatever you feel like, but you do have to gatekeep at some point. You just can't have people who are clearly not trying to be woman in the Women's National Basketball Association, and that's my thoughts on that issue. And then I had another post. I said, libertarian perspectives on the changing media landscape, and I said, the media landscape is something that is always changing. Gone are the days when legacy media could just push out whatever narratives it wants to without any pushback whatsoever. These days, social media / independent media are generally what controls the narratives. With that being said, you definitely have different tiers of those who, when it comes to influence, you have people like Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan, whose podcast interviews tend to be very popular compared to smaller creators such as myself, who'd be lucky to get even double the views an episode of their podcast. I'm still going to keep doing it, though. I have every right to freedom of speech, even if no one chooses to listen. In the end, it comes down to what each individual wants to listen to at any given moment. Media that is popular today is not going to be popular forever. Tastes very much change with the times. Thoughts. And then another user replied, and I said in response, they said, there's media and there's journalism. I said in response, what constitutes true journalism is always going to be in the eye of the beholder. Historically, people like myself haven't had access to getting out narratives through the legacy media. I have no idea what the process to get on broadcast or cable news is, or publish a piece on a news outlet, even a libertarian one like Reason. The only piece I know the publication history of when it comes to news outlets is the Unabomber's Manifesto. Now, thanks to social media, people are free to listen to whatever nut jobbers that they want to. I think that's a lot more libertarian than the previous media landscape, where people were basically required to have media and journalism training to participate. Also, a lot of the legacy media isn't free to publish in. I just got an email recently from a woman who works for a PR firm, might be a scam, who said she saw my podcast on LinkedIn and wanted to get me published on a legacy media website. Of course, I likely will have to pay X amount to go through with it. It's a big reason I like radio, even though I can't stand the general user base. I can publish my shit for free as long as they typically overzealous Reddit mods don't take it down. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Personally, I think the current media landscape is a lot more libertarian than the old one. You have people publish stuff to their own YouTube accounts. It doesn't even matter if they don't have any following whatsoever. They can't get, they can post whatever they feel like. Ultimately, the platforms can still censor it, but ultimately there's less of a barrier to entry, I said, than under the old system, where you pretty much had to have media or journalism training to get on, a broadcast network or write for a newspaper like the New York Times. And I personally think that's the right direction from a libertarian perspective. And let's see if there's anything new. Let's see. Looks like there's nothing new. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.